Election results might delight or disappoint us, but do they also affect the size of our families? New research examines the partisan impact of the 2016 presidential election in the US by investigating who decided to have children afterwards. Hello, Gordon. Welcome.
Hello, Tim.
Now, Gordon, as far as I can understand it, your hypothesis here is that following the 2016 election, people who liked Donald Trump, they were inspired to have more children. People who didn't like Donald Trump were inspired to have fewer children. Is this because of the particular polarization around that election and the political environment afterwards, or do we have a precedent for this?
So I don't think we have a precedent that's been documented in the literature yet, but you are right, Tim, that today's political environment is more polarized than in the past. And so, the main finding of our paper is going to be that people who like Trump, namely Republicans, are going to increase their fertility, their number of conceptions, whereas Democrats are going to reduce the number of children they have. When we looked at other elections, if we scroll back 20 years ago to another election that was hotly contested, the Gore versus George W. Bush election, we do also find an effect. But consistent with this idea that, polarization's gotten worse, those effects are smaller. So I think you're onto something there.
And to find out whether this is true or not, do you have to go to parents and ask them if they're Democrats or Republicans?
Yeah, that would be fantastic. It would be great if we knew if you're a Republican or a Democrat. And we're going to use birth certificate data, which has a lot of information, but unfortunately it does not ask your political party. So we couldn't do that. So we had to come up with another way to find out if fertility responded. And what we did is we characterized counties as either Republican leaning or Democratic leaning. And the way we did that is we said, in the last presidential election, how many people voted for the Republican and how many people voted for the Democrats? We can kind of see which counties have which leanings. And then we can say, let's compare the fertility rates in Republican-leaning counties before and after Trump was elected to the Democratic fertility. And by the way, that's the main idea. But we also said, Trump attracted a very different coalition of voters than the traditional Republican base. And so we also try to look at the new voters that he's drawn in and classify counties as newly attracted Republicans. And you sort of get the same pattern emerging, that places that lean Republican or have started to lean towards the new Republican coalition have more babies than the counties that were more Democratic in their leanings.
Can we put some numbers on this, the difference in the fertility between the Republican and the Democrat leaning counties? And can we go as far as to do a calculation to say how many more tiny Republicans there were and how many fewer little Democrats?
Yeah, we can talk about those tiny Republicans and Democrats. So one thing to just note to begin with is there's already an existing gap between Republican and Democratic fertility. Republican counties have higher fertility rates than Democratic counties. And what the election of Trump did was further widen that gap by about 17%. And what does that mean? In particular, if we want to put a number on this, what we're talking about is about a difference of 46,000 differential births that we wouldn't have otherwise had being the difference between those two groups. So it widens that gap by 46,000 births. Is 46,000 births a large amount or a small amount? Well, that's about 0.6% of the entire fertility over this same time period. So it's not a huge amount, but it's not nothing either.
And can we rule out these pre-existing trends? The idea that, Democrats are more worried about climate change, so they might feel less inclined to bring another person into the world to experience it. Can you be sure that this is not a factor?
One of the things that we're going to do in our study and what makes it try to get at what we sometimes call a causal effect instead of just a correlation is we're going to take advantage of the fact that Trump's election was unexpected. Few people predicted he would win. If you look at like the New York Times or the 538 polls, both of those were saying he has about a 20% chance of winning. Even if you looked at election markets, markets where there's real money on the line, 12% chance of a Trump victory. So this was unexpected. And what we can do is we can take advantage of the unexpectedness of this election to say, we've really changed people's views really sharply. It wasn't a gradual change. It was a huge shock to people. And so what we do as economists, we call these event studies. When there's a shock that was not anticipated, you can look before versus after. And what that does is it says everything was kind of chugging along as it would have been. People were having babies at the rates they were going to have babies. And then all of a sudden, you added this new piece of information, which is, oh, Trump's going to be the president. And that's not what you thought before. And the idea is, a Republican would say, maybe policies will change that I like, or other things will happen. But it's that idea of a shock. And this also tells you why, for example, we don't really know what the effect of Obama's election was on fertility. Why? It wasn't a surprise. There was no new information which happened at a very precise moment that we as researchers can define. And so that's the idea of how we can get a causal effect instead of just a correlation, rule out all these other confounding factors, is it was a surprise.
Now, we can't work out whether the parents individually were Republicans or Democrats, but can we look inside their heads at all and find out the motivations why they are reducing or increasing their fertility? Is it primarily material? Are they thinking about being richer or poorer? Or is it more subtle, more profound than that?
Well, I think the first thing you say, that's a pretty profound point in and of itself, that, people decide to have babies based on economic factors. That's well known. When unemployment rates are high, fertility drops. And so I think part of it is economics. And let me tell you why we think some of it might be economics. If you look at surveys of people's expectations about the future economic climate, like their optimism about their economic position in society, if you look before the election of Donald Trump, Democrats are very optimistic about the future economy. Republicans are very pessimistic. Almost overnight, as soon as this unexpected victory of Trump happens, these switch positions. Democrats become incredibly pessimistic about the economy, and Republicans become incredibly optimistic about the policy. And that may be because policies will be implemented that affect them, or it may be other reasons. And so we think part of it's about economic optimism, as you say, that this is, they think they're going to have the money to support a child. But I also think that if you look at other surveys, there's also big changes in expectations about the future climate, political and social climate. People have less optimism about the direction that America's heading. And once again, Democrats very positive before the election, Republicans very pessimistic, and that flips almost overnight. And so it says it's not just money, but it's about optimism about kind of the society we live in or what policies will be implemented. And now this is I'm hypothesizing now. This may or may not be true, but when a Trump rally happens and more people are supporting Trump, think if you're a Republican, you say, I didn't know so many people thought like me and that the world looked more like what I wanted it to look like. Maybe I should have a baby. Whereas a Democrat might say, I didn't know people didn't really agree with me. And, do I really want to bring a child into this type of world that has all of these problems? And so I think that would be the more profound, but also the more bit of a stretch to claim. The economic one seems pretty direct.
There was a particular amount of controversy around some of Trump's statements in 2016 and policies afterwards around the Latino community. He made some very strong statements about immigrants from Mexico bringing crime and drugs, and he even speculated that some of them might be rapists. So do we find the same change in fertility in the Hispanic population? Because you would assume that their attitudes, their optimism about the future might be changed by the Trump election.
That's a good question, Tim. And what's different about Hispanics is whether you're Hispanic is recorded on your birth certificate. So we could look at the answer to this question directly. And the first thing to note is Hispanics vote overwhelmingly Democratic. They went 2-for-1 for Hillary Clinton. So that's a landslide for a particular group. And what we see is that Hispanics living in the same county as non-Hispanics, their fertility declined precipitously. And another way to think about it is not just Hispanics versus non-Hispanic fertility, but also, by the way, and that effect is about twice as large as the effect we found for Republican versus Democratic counties. So this was a targeted group. If I compare the Hispanics to groups that heavily supported Trump, say evangelical whites or rural whites in rural counties, this gap gets even bigger. And so the idea is evangelical whites, rural whites, they're having babies at higher and higher rates after Trump gets elected, whereas the Hispanics are sharply dropping their fertility.
It's very interesting because this, as you say, was an unexpected event. So economically, we can track it. this time. But at the same time, in the United States, power switches fairly regularly between Democrats and Republicans, backwards and forwards. So if this effect is consistent across those different administrations, does it all balance out and this is quirky and interesting, or is there a more important policy implication from this?
Yeah, I think you're right to notice that, this would balance out if we just always shifted between Republican and Democratic presidential candidates. And why would we care? Well, I think we care for the following reason. Let me try to make a bigger point. One of the biggest challenges facing most modern economies is a declining fertility rate. China's having big problems with really sharp drops in fertility. Europe has below replacement fertility. Places like Italy are very worried about the future. In the US, we also have declining fertility, not as bad as Europe or China, but we still have this same fertility trap problem. And so what I think we're learning from this is something like partisanship can affect people's decision to have a baby. And it means that other things are likely to affect it as well. And let me just kind of come full circle. If we could come up with ways of changing people's optimism about the future, both economically and non-economically, but in ways that aren't related to partisanship, then we could maybe solve some of this fertility gap. Are there any policies that a president could implement that would attract both Republican and Democratic support? I think there are a few, like the child tax credit or the earned income tax credit. We've just seen recent expansions of those in the US, and they had bipartisan support. And so something like that could actually, what we're seeing is that could probably get everyone, both Republicans and Democrats, to have more babies.
Well, it'd be interesting to see how many bipartisan policies that there are in the near future in the United States. From an outsider's point of view, you seem that those are not very successful at the moment, but it's a fascinating piece of work, Gordon. Thank you very much for talking about it.
Well, thank you very much, Tim. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
Well, it's a great paper and one you're guaranteed to have an opinion on. So, it's called Partisan-Fertility and Presidential Elections. The authors Gordon Dahl, Runjing Liu and William Mullins. It's discussion paper 16821 at the CEPR, or you can download it using this link. Well, thanks for watching, and we'll see you soon.